Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for joining. I hope you had an amazing week. I'd love to start off by maybe you stating your career history, your educational background, and anything of the sorts.
Uh, Thank you very much for having me, Kennedy. Um, I'm an economist and sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania, uh, where I've been for over 50 years. Um, my PhD was in economics, um, originally and continue to today with focus on the process of economic development, by which I mean low and middle income countries throughout the world, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I continue to work particularly on human resources in those countries. By human resources, I mean health, nutrition, education, training, what determines human resources, and what impacts do those human resources have.
Very cool. And I really like that niche, and I feel like it's just so impactful for the community, and we thank you. Secondly, I noticed you are a research associate at Penn's Population Study Center. And I was just wondering why you maybe think research is essential or important.
I think uh, for people like me who are academics, research is central to us learning about the human condition and what might improve the human condition. So I probably spend the majority of my time involved in research topics, as I said before, on human resources, particularly in low and middle income countries. And I think some of the questions in which I'm engaged are pretty critical for the future of humanity. For example, currently there are estimates of something like 250 million children under 5 years of age in the world who are not likely to develop to their potential. Now, 250 million children, 250 million is about 70% of the US population, but these are only children under 5, so this is a very large number. And they are viewed at risk of not achieving their developmental potential because they are either undernourished or because they're living in poverty. So part of what my research is focused upon is what are the determinants of being undernourished, what are the impacts of being undernourished, how do they play out over the life cycle, and that kind of a topic has important implications, not only for the children as they grow up in the coming decades, but for their societies as well, because it will affect a lot how productive the children are as they grow up, and therefore how productive the societies are.
Amazing. Yeah. And I feel like it's so essential to answer that why question and just kind of building upon that to find a greater solution. I really appreciate and liked your example. Next, I was wondering why you think economics is important or a valuable asset for one to have.
I think economics is a very good asset to have because economics is about how entities. Entities may be people, they may be families, they may be firms, they may be schools, health providers, how different entities make decisions, how they decide what to give priority to, given that all these entities have limitations on what resources are available to them. If resources were unlimited, then it wouldn't make much difference how you use resources, how much to go to some of my areas of research, how much you invested in your children's health and nutrition, how much you invested in their education, how much instead you invested in improving the productivity of your farm or your firm, how much instead of investing, you decide to consume concurrently rather than investing to get returns in the future. So there's all these kind of decisions that all different entities make. And I think economics helps students, and some of whom may become economists, to think through the process of what are different incentives, what are resources, what determines kind of outcomes that prevail in the real world, and how might policies improve those outcomes, or how might those entities respond to negative shocks, say environmental shocks, or perhaps political shocks, other shocks. And they point to the importance of what economists often would call unintended consequences. For example, by I'm just going to pick an arbitrary example, by criminalizing work in the sex industry, one effectively drives the industry underground, and that tends to increase the public health risk of spread of infectious sexually related diseases, which was not the intent at all of the policy, but nevertheless, it happens. Likewise, all policies have a multitude of consequences because households, families, firms, other entities, again, make a multitude of decisions, not only decisions related to what the policies are directed towards. And if the policies effectively change their resources or change their incentives, they'll change all sorts of forms of behavior. So I think just for learning to think about how one might oneself make decisions, how one might understand the impacts of what's going on in society, including policies, but other events. Economics provides a very good framework, even if the intent of the student is just to study the first year of introductory economics. And of course, that's enhanced and enriched with further study in upper undergraduate level, or for a smaller set of students, maybe even at the graduate level. I guess I should say.
Yeah, keep going.
Yes, I should say I did not answer what some people hearing this might have expected. I didn't say, well, economics will teach you how to get rich on the stock market, or something along those lines. It is true that economists are concerned about the stock market, are concerned about all sorts of markets. But I think sometimes before people study economics, they think of economics as being very narrowly focused, firstly, on the U.S. economy. And U.S. accounts for about 4% of the world's population. I happen to focus on the 84% that live in low and middle income countries. And secondly, on particular institutions, I think the stock market would be the best example. And while these ways of thinking and approaching problems do apply to thinking about stock markets in the US, they have much broader application. And many economists, I included, focus on topics that are fairly distant from the Dow Jones average on the stock markets, like, how healthy are 3-year-olds?
Yeah, I really like that you mentioned that it's not just this narrow perspective. It's super broad. There are so many things that go into it, and it's not just all money focused. There's so many examples of just economic pursuers and professors using their knowledge for the greater good. And I really like that you touched on that. Additionally, as you are a professor at Penn and a Stown professor at Penn, I was wondering, in what ways do you think Penn's economics program differs from other universities?
I think economics is a fairly unified discipline in the sense that economists at all the major universities tend to approach economics in a similar way. So that would be true for both private and state universities, pretty much across the board. That commonality will typically include, firstly, macroeconomics, macro meaning overall aggregate economics. So to look at questions like, how does Federal Reserve monetary policy affect outcomes in the economy? Or how does the government deficit affect outcomes in the economy? Secondly, there include microeconomics, which is focused on entities of the sort I mentioned before, including firms, including the nature of competition or market power within markets, but also including consumers, households, and other entities like schools and the healthcare system. The healthcare system in the US and in most economies is a big part of the economy, accounting for maybe 15% of the product in the economy. And then beyond macro and micro, there tends to be courses on how do you analyze data. Economics tends to focus on quantitative data, although more qualitative interview data are also sometimes used. But there's a question about how do we learn what the empirical world is really like? And that's very challenging since there's so many things that are hard to observe. To take a very simple example, schooling is associated with many outcomes we think are good. higher wage rates, better health, longer life, better luck in partnering with people, a lot of things that we think are good. But it's a question whether your schooling causes those outcomes or whether something else is not observed. Maybe one's motivation, one's ambition, one's personality are really important factors in determining these outcomes. And schooling is partly just a proxy for the effects of those outcomes. So if one's interested in trying to find out what the effects of schooling are, somehow one has to control for those other factors that also may be important and also may be associated with schooling. To give just one very quick example, one way economists, including myself, have attempted to do this is to look at special data, in particular data on twins. So twins, identical twins especially, share a lot in common. Identical twins, all twins have common family background typically, common neighborhoods, common schools, at least at the initial levels. Yet they tend to vary in terms of how much schooling between twins and pairs. And so it's possible to use twins data to control for all these factors twins have in common and see what difference it makes when they have different schooling. And that would be just one example. There are many examples, but trying to think about how you interpret what you see in the world is important. And the development of inside statistical tools to do so is this third big area of economics. So as I said, those are pretty common across different universities. In the case of the University of Pennsylvania, what I think is a particular strength is integrating theoretical models of behaviors of people or firms with empirical studies. So rather than just looking at the relation between schooling and wages, place the analysis within the framework of how do households and individuals decide to invest in schooling rather than doing something else, and what other factors affect that investment and in fact the outcomes that come from schooling. So I would say Penn is strong on integrating the modeling and the empirical assessments.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I really like how you put into perspective like the different layers that come into it and how Penn is really good at incorporating everything. Nextly, I was just wondering, where do you see the future of economics or economics careers in general?
One direction that economics is going in, and many academic disciplines are going in, not surprisingly, is fuller use of AI to investigate various questions. I mean, one example on the empirical side would be the development of machine learning methods which enable the analysis of huge amounts of data. there are huge amounts of data in our society. Every time you go to a store and use your credit card, you're adding to the database, both in regard to what your preferences are, what decisions you make, but also aggregating from you to millions of people what many people are doing. And the development of machine learning methods has enriched a lot the possibility of understanding better consumer behavior, but also understanding better education, understanding better health. So one way already underway, but that I think it for sure will continue and expand for economics will be to use better the incredibly rich information that exists in any society to understand better economic questions. Another way that, in a sense, I've hinted at or I've stated, your economists are not at all limited to some narrow area of what one might think of as economics, back to my example about the stock market, but bring insight into an ever wider range of questions. And in our society, and here, I mean the US, but also the rest of the world, one reality looking forward is continuing change in terms of population. For example, rapidly aging of population in the US and in many other countries. And that has implications for things like intergenerational relations, in part through policies. Currently there are several people of working age for every retiree in the United States. Over time, with a fair amount of certainty, one can project that ratio will keep going down. So what does that mean? US and many countries have social security systems in which pensions, public pensions at least, depend in part on contributions by current workers. Well, if the current workers relative to the Chinese goes down, politically, are the current workers going to be happy with that situation? With the increased taxes, et cetera, that would imply on them. And, is that going to strain resources, change the political interaction between generations, et cetera? Or another example would be with aging, the nature of the dominant diseases changed substantially. Historically, for humanity, the dominant diseases were infectious diseases, early life diseases, maternal health diseases. But over time of increasing importance are what are called non-communicable diseases, diseases like cardiac diseases, cancers, and mental health issues. And those are going to increase rapidly as populations age, and that poses a whole different set of economic and societal issues. Other developments probably will too. As you're probably aware, there's increasing emphasis among biologists on what's called the holobiome, HALOBIOME, which is thinking about biology in a more holistic, integrated way for humans, thinking of their own biomes, not just as individual agents. For plants, same thing. And that's going to change not only biology, but also economics and other disciplines. So the good news is there's lots of exciting things on the horizon, to which I think economics can contribute importantly. The bad news is we don't deal well with some of these situations. We may have considerable problems.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, there's kind of the balance of the two. Um, my last question is there any articles, books, resources you think are knowledgeable for someone maybe just starting within the field of economics?
And I find this a more difficult question than you might think. In part, that is because research economics rarely focuses on books per se, but focuses on individual articles that are pretty directed to a particular problem, such as examples I have given, the rapidly increasing cognitive decline of older people, for example. But I think one idea does come to mind to respond to your question, which is a fairly popular program or set of programs. And that's the Freakonomics series. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Freak, F-R-E-A-K, economics. There's podcasts, there's books, and there's shorter presentations. For example, one of their podcasts is called No Stupid Question. It's hosted by Angela Duckworth, who's actually a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, and Stephen Grauer, who's an economist with Freakonomics. And I think it's illustrative of how one can think, in part using economic concepts, about a range of problems, in particular using the notion of opportunity cost, the idea that when you do something, when you decide to go to school, there's an opportunity cost because you can't use the time you're at school doing something else. And one wants to incorporate the opportunity cost into thinking about different issues. One also wants to think about, as I said before, possible unintended consequences. So I think that, let me call it mini industry or mini firm, Freakonomics, the books, the podcasts, the particular podcast I mentioned called No Stupid Questions, are good ways to get some exposure to how economists-like people think, or what questions they are likely to have when they look at some phenomena in society.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I'll make sure to check all of those out. I greatly appreciate your time today, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, and I hope you and your audience find this and the other recordings you're making useful in their learning about economics and thinking about economics. So good day.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.